Hello Internet, Gino, that Pinguino Greco here again with another episode of Deep Listens, and today we are going to be talking about Hellblade, Senua's Sacrifice, and I am joined, as always, by Peter Gunganir Busby.
Isn't Gunganir the spear?
Yeah, that's Odin's spear.
Well, it never misses, so I'll take that. Much like my jump shot, constantly finds the target. Hello everybody, welcome to a game that I think ambitious would be the best way to describe it, you know, for good and potentially for ill, depending on how we'll discuss. But a quality game that really took a reach, and I think it's one that'll be well discussed here on Deep Listens.
Yes, and we are also joined by special guest Noelle Ragnarok Greco.
Thanks. The Thor movie is fantastic, guys. I highly recommend it.
I gotta say, when there are lore stones in this game that like tell you different aspects of Norse mythology, and one of them was saying Ragnarok is coming. I was like, this is great tie-in, guys.
No, it's already out. It's not coming. It's done.
Yeah, but when the game came out, it was coming.
Oh, you're right.
How much? So we've now played at least 2 games of Greek mythology now, right? Are there more?
Yeah, so we've played
this
Jotun, which is definitively Greek mythology, but we also played... Norse. Norse, yeah. Yes. We played that, but we've also played I've played Final Fantasy VII, and Final Fantasy VII has a location named Midgar.
I already read asking.
And a location named Nibelheim. So it's got a big snake.
Nice.
Just for funsies?
So it rips off some Norse mythology. Odin's there.
After enough Final Fantasy, have a big snake?
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, so do a lot of things, but okay.
That's a good point.
I think those are the two big... I mean, Jotun obviously is the closest thing. And it feels like Jotun and Hellblade have a lot of overlap.
True.
But I don't even know which one... We'll discuss the versions of Norse mythology that we've seen in the course of this podcast. But before that, just a reminder, if you want to get in touch with the show, you can do so at Deep Listens Pod or at That Pinguino on Twitter. You can also go to deeplistens.libsyn.com and hit up our comment sections, or perhaps you can send us an email, deeplistenspodcast@gmail.com. We do not have any specific feedback for today. I think we might have some feedback for other shows, but not for this show. So, just another reminder, and if you like the show, please rate and review on iTunes or whatever site you're using to listen to this. If you're just kind of, holding your ear up, just catching it from the airwaves, just shout 5 out of 5, and the ratings and reviews they'll just flow. It's really about word of mouth.
The universe will provide.
Yes. So actually, I heard this from a podcast I listened to. If you have a friend who has a podcasting app and they let you use their phone for like half a second, just subscribe them to the show.
Steal your friends' phones.
Yeah, they'll probably not notice, and if they do notice, maybe they'll listen. And maybe they'll give us the review we desire. So
or just review it also while you're stealing their phone.
Yeah, you could also, instead of subscribing them, you could review on their phone. Really, once you have their phone, you have their life. So do what you will. And with that, let's discuss Hellblade, Senua's Sacrifice.
Do it.
This is a great game. And Pete, why don't you give us the rundown? What is Hellblade?
Hellblade, okay. So Senua is a picked, P-I-C-T, picked warrior. As I've read, it's a... how would you describe it? It's like a Norse group, clan. Let's say clan. It's like a Norse clan. And her lover has been killed, and she's now carrying around his head, right? Because that's where the soul is in Norse mythology. And at the beginning, you're sort of on this journey to transport this head somewhere where then you can then lay your lover to rest. And then on the way, Senua sort of goes through this journey where she encounters sort of lots of problems from her past, but those problems from her past are reflected through her own struggles with mental illness, basically, right? The game, I don't think the game ever uses the term mental illness. but that's basically what's happening here, right? Senua is mentally ill if we look at it from sort of a neurotypical perspective, right? She'd be mentally ill compared to the neurotypical, and sort of her grappling with that and sort of how it both allows and forces her to see the world. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, if you listen or read, I think they have like a documentary afterwards that you can watch. And apparently she has psychosis symptoms, which psychosis is not actually a disorder, it's symptoms that include like hallucinations, auditory, visual, and delusions. And she also apparently has depression and anxiety. So those are the specific mental illnesses that are being dealt with. Mostly psychosis, but the other ones are sprinkled in there.
Yeah, and all of those things manifest themselves in the form of a quest that Senua, it's unclear how much of what she's seeing is actually there, how much of it is in her mind. There are some moments where very explicitly there are things that are clearly illusions that her mind is creating, but basic questions like where am I, what am I doing right now, who am I talking to, who am I listening to, it's always a back and forth of is this happening in reality or in Senua's reality as she understands it. And the game never really makes clear. There's never a moment where you're not in her mind.
Yeah, you're really from her perspective the entire time. So you're hearing the voices she's hearing, you're seeing whatever she's seeing, and you're kind of sucked into whatever emotions she's exuding at the time.
Yeah, and it's really impressive, I think, how they handle her voices. So the voices are the first thing that I think jump out at you. The game starts with a narrator who kind of ushers you into Senua's story. And that narrator, because it's in the same voice as Senua and as many of the voices that are speaking in her head, it's unclear whether that narrator is actually a yet another one of Senua's voices, or if the voice is actually a narrator, like an omniscient narrator, which I thought was a clever touch.
Mm-hmm.
And then, go ahead.
Especially given that sort of, it's not as if the voices share Senua's epistemology or sort of her knowledge. Like they know things she doesn't know. Like during combat, one of them might scream, "Look behind you," right? They have knowledge Senua might not necessarily have. So it's interesting to sort of ask, at some level, does Senua know this and this is just sort of an access point for it? Or are they actually tapping into some sort of external knowledge sources?
Well, I think based on what she has, like psychosis and anxiety, both can have the side effect of hypervigilance. So even though I guess it's not in your frame, whenever you're looking at something, it's possible that she is recognizing it, and just the manifestation of that is the voices telling her that.
Yeah, and it is really impressive because the voices, there are a few voices, I'd say as many as 4 or 5, distinct, different, they're not personalities. She doesn't seem to have multiple personality disorder. But, well, no. Actually, I should say...
Dissociative personality disorder. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Dissociative personality. That is what she has, or that is what...
That is what she does not have.
She doesn't have.
Okay.
Yeah.
Multiple She does not seem to have dissociative personality disorder. Unless, I guess you could say, there's some voices that sound like people she knew. And those voices, it's unclear whether they are actually speaking to her or whether they are kind of aspects of her personality who have taken on the voices of people that she cared about. But there's a chorus, kind of a chorus of voices that are in Senua's voice, but express different emotions than the main character seems to be expressing. So, like, there's some voices that, Senua, you can't do it. You won't succeed. And then other voices, you must succeed. You must go forward. And they'll be kind of arguing with themselves. Oh, Senua, you look so foolish. You look brave. And it's just all these emotions happening all at once. And with headphones on, which was the way I played, it's in stereo, so you'll hear one voice in one spot, one voice in another, and it feels like you're surrounded.
Mm-hmm. Does the game actually... I think there's a message at the beginning that even suggests headphones, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it's really the way to play.
Yeah, absolutely.
But this chorus of voices and the way that it tells you, like, it manages to both execute a really elegant bit of game design because these voices kind of act as tutorials and guides for you, but also they are in what is the term? Is it diegetic noise? What's the term for sound that is within the scene itself?
Oh man, I should know this. My narrative theory is really lackluster. It's probably diegetic, yeah.
Let me look this up because it's going to bother me.
I'm disappointed in myself now.
Yeah, they basically managed to put information into the game, like the look out behind you when you're in combat. That is really, really useful from a gameplay perspective, but also it builds the world and it builds Senua's character at the same time. It's really elegant.
Yep.
And so you're basically starting out in this forest that seems to be haunted or at least brutalized in some way, and you're making your journey to Hell. Hel.
Yeah, 1L.
He single hockey stick. So what did you guys think about like the early part of the game? Because I think the framing is pretty good.
Mm-hmm. I mean, obviously, like you said, the noise, the voices are really the first thing that gets you. But then after that, it's very clear that you're dealing with some sort of massacre that's happened. And I mean, given that the story involves the Vikings, I mean, that's pretty much what the Vikings did. In my very, very limited knowledge of Vikings, I should say. But like, it's very clear early on, their bodies dangling, tied to the trees. Something very, very sinister is happening here, both from Senua's individual perspective and sort of a larger cultural clash, let's say, maybe even genocide happening as well.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that like it started out where you're seeing bodies hanging and you're hearing like the head in the bag that you're carrying like talk to you, and it like from the get-go you are questioning which part of this is real, which part of it is in her head. So I think it like really started off strong.
There are a few more dramatic things to start a game with than a head in a bag. Like, you're sending a message early on.
Yes, head in a bag, and this as soon as you start off in this forest, and then once you kind of make it through the forest, you see this mountain that is like the access point to hell. And as soon as you see it, like the voices are like, we should turn back, this isn't the right way, she needs to climb up, she needs to go, we shouldn't do it. And then as you get closer and closer, you encounter the gate to hell, which is pretty great. And you can't get through because the living cannot cross the gate to hell. And so you must take on 2 challenges.
So you just throw the head in and then hope for the best.
Just like, yeah, later.
You just say, Rainmaker, and then throw it over the gate. And then you just hear a swish, and then she's like, and now Dillion's soul is rescued.
She yelled Kobe, which didn't seem historically appropriate, but all the same.
And then, like Kobe, she missed, but it was glorious. So you have to get the gate open. Before you even get the gate open, you come across, I believe, the main puzzle type, or one of the main puzzle types in the game, which is runes.
Yep.
Because of Senua's hypervigilance, she can see things that patterns in the world that other people cannot see. And so there are these runes that block many doors in the game, and when you focus on them, you will kind of have this pattern just floating over the screen kind of at all times, and then you have to find those runes in the environment around you. And once you do, the doors magically unlock.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Okay. Also, people with some kind of psychosis are also usually better at finding like figures in things that don't actually have figures. So yeah, that's also a nice tidbit.
Yeah.
With like the hypervigilance, they also are more likely to see like faces in things that don't actually have faces, and see patterns where there may be patterns, but it's not obvious to most people.
Yeah, and that is definitely communicated through the gameplay, that there are these patterns, like, do the doors exist? Do these patterns really exist? Are these runes actually magic? It doesn't matter, because in Senua's conception of the world, they do, and magic does exist. So as far as the game is concerned, it's real. It's all real.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that they do a pretty clever job of the runes.
I think in the abstract, it's a good mechanic. You know, it makes sense for what they're doing. It fits the character. It fits the world they're building. But I mean, ultimately, I found it generally frustrating, which is perhaps the point. You know what I mean? But I always feel like frustration as gameplay mechanic isn't the best choice, even when it fits in. And maybe, you know, I'm applying a simplistic or prosaic definition of game when I do something like that, but I can't really escape it, in all honesty.
Yeah. But I think that's kind of the point. Like, me and Gino were having this conversation yesterday. I think the point of the game was to be frustrating. Like, it's trying to show you the experience of someone with psychosis and someone with depression and anxiety, and that's not a fun thing to have.
No, by no means.
Like, when I have a panic attack, I'm not like, oh, that's great, I can't wait for my next one. It's like, that's awful, I would rather not do that again.
Yeah, it really does. So this is where I struggle, because there's moments where I feel the sense of panic and the sense of frustration are really appropriate and earned. And then there are moments where the frustration feels very gamey. And those are the moments where it bothered me, is where it's the nature of it being a game and there being an objective you're supposed to find that I felt really just annoyed. Mm-hmm. Like, sometimes there were moments where the runes will often be, there's a shadow, there's a tree that's crooked in a certain way. And so you can see clearly, okay, this has got to be the rune. This is a thing that looks unnatural. It's got weird angles. This has to be it. But the game doesn't count it until you line it up perfectly. And so you're just kind of wandering around. It feels like highlights for kids a little bit, like spot the thing that's out of place. And then you just have to line it up so that it's in the right angle, and then the game acknowledges that you found the right solution. Mm-hmm. And that was super frustrating in spots. But some of the other moments where Senua is legitimately panicked, or moments where she's surrounded by darkness and it's hard to see, and it's moments like that where there's not a pressure of some enemy coming to kill you or it delaying you from progressing, where I thought that it really worked.
I think this is an issue we're going to talk more about later on, I'm sure, so I'll just sort of signpost it here. But I think this is another issue that comes up, and the game is very sort of self-consciously not a sim, if I can put it that way, and I think that's going to have ramifications for a lot of the things we discuss moving forward.
Yeah. So once you solve some of these rune puzzles, you have to pick between two gods that you have to basically challenge. There is Surt, the god of fire, and the other dude is the god of illusion. What's his name? Does anyone remember?
Loki.
It's not Loki.
It's not Loki, no. Well, Loki's brought up a lot. He's kind of a dick.
While we're looking for things, do they still make those mints called Certs? C-E-R-T? I used to like those mints.
They're pretty good. I don't know if they still make them. And the god of illusion was Valravn.
Valravn, of course.
Valravn,
who else could it have been?
The crow. So I went with Valravn as the god I would take on first.
As do I.
Valravn, I thought his path was probably one of the most interesting mechanics in the game. There would be, so in his level, there are a bunch of basically arches with bones kind of on top. And when you walk through the arch, something about the world, when seen through the arch, will change. And as you kind of walk through those arches, you kind of toggle between two versions of reality. One that has, maybe there's a wall, and then the other one, the wall's gone. Because Valravn's the god of illusion. So some of these things are they're not really there. I thought that maybe the section went on a little long. Like, I felt like there was maybe one or two too many segments before you found Valravn, but I liked the mechanic.
It's one of the better deployments of, I'll just call it the sort of lens of truth mechanic that I've seen. And maybe the game itself lends it to that sort of idea, but the like sort of when you walk into I think it's the third or the final section, and the whole place is just covered in ravens, right? It's very clear at the very beginning, a very overwhelming sensation, like, oh, there's no way I'll be able to line these things up. So you have to sort of backtrack and get rid of illusions before you can see, okay, which are the real illusions. And that's one of the things about sort of organic frustration or organic anxiety, I think, Gino, that you could have pointed to there.
Yeah. There's up until that point, you have these ravens in the sky, and you need to make the mark of Valravn to remove some grand illusion. And you basically do it by lining things up. And so you have to kind of navigate, okay, what perspective will I have to stand at to line these things up properly? And that moment when there's just too many ravens, I agree. That was really the moment that I thought it worked the best. Mm-hmm. And the moment in the end where you encounter Valravn, because it feels like you're solving a puzzle, and then all of a sudden he's on you, and it's a fight. And I guess this is a good time to talk about the fights, because up until that point you fight a few just kind of goons, and you've got a light attack, a heavy attack, a dodge, and then a block.
There's a kick, too.
There is? I didn't use the kick at all.
Yeah, you can kick.
Is the kick useful? Is that what you do to the shield guys?
It's a teep, basically. It's a front kick that creates space.
Well, that sounds like it would have been useful for me to use.
Yeah, it was.
Well, damn. To hell with me, then.
I mean, I was going to say it, but I'm glad you did.
Yeah.
Comedy.
But the fight with Valravn I thought was pretty cool. This is... He's way faster and trickier than any of the enemies you fought to up this point. He can, like, teleport around. He's got this cool flying move that he flies at you. And then eventually, when you beat him down enough, he turns into smoke. And that's when you learn how to focus. And you've got this mirror that once you enter focus mode, it turns smoky enemies real. And it basically lets you wail on enemies with kind of slowdown, like a time slowdown.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, except the ones that are all smoky aren't slowed down. They are at normal speed.
It depends. Sometimes they're slowed down, but not as much as normal enemies. And sometimes they're not slowed down at all. It seems a little wonky about when they're slowed down or not. But it was interesting.
And just setting aside Valravn, that was it, right? Valravn?
Yep.
Just setting aside Valravn for a second, just talking about combat in general, it's satisfying in its brutality, I guess I should put it, which, I don't know, it's good for the game, because I think at a certain point you need to sort of feel like a badass, and the combat gives that to you. But it's also, there's a large sort of cultural narrative about the sort of trauma of violence going on. And I mean, maybe it's empowering in its way. She's sort of appropriating this violence for herself. She's becoming a warrior, whereas previously this violence was thrust upon her. So, I mean, you could certainly read it that way. It's an interesting juxtaposition to say, okay, we're talking about the trauma of violence from a sort of societal, genocidal perspective, but maybe the empowering of violence for this particular individual in her moment.
Yeah, and I think there's also something about the brutality of Senua's combat, and then the way that after you've fought this enemy, they just disappear into smoke. Mm-hmm. That makes...
But they bleed when they get hit?
Yeah, they bleed, too. But then they disappear into smoke, and it makes you realize how much... It just emphasizes how much things are in her mind, that the battle... the game repeatedly says something along the lines of the harshest battles or the most difficult battles are fought in the mind. Mm-hmm. And every single one of the battles, like after you defeat a warrior, another one will just appear in his place and keep fighting you. And it's always the same 3 or 4 guys, which kind of starts to imply that maybe she's fought, she's only fought 4 or 5 people. But each of those battles just made such an impact on her that it just keeps replaying over and over and over again.
Yeah. Also, to go back to the brutality of it thing, her trauma isn't so much from the acts of violence, I don't think. It's like the loss of Dillian, who is her boyfriend, lover, whoever that is. and then how her father treated her, which wasn't really with violence, but more just like locked her away.
I think it's relevant though that both Dillian and we might as well. Should we start folding in spoilers while we're here?
Yeah, so spoiler time. I mean, if we weren't spoiling up until this point, spoilers now.
And it's a very story-driven story. That was too weird, but
it's a very story-driven
game. So I think it's relevant that both Dillian and her mother died in such sort of horrific fashions, though.
Yeah, I think her mother was more, because Dillian didn't, like, she saw him once he was already dead.
Yeah, she saw the aftermath.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's like the fighting that would do it. It's like the image of it. Like, he was like splayed open, wasn't he?
He was missing a leg. He was all strung up. He had a lot of stuff going on.
None of it
wasn't great.
No, none of it was good. Yeah, so maybe, and just given the society she would have existed in, maybe the brutality isn't so much the issue as the loss and the fact that it was her father inflicting this sort of brutality.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah,
Sure.
and those moments when her flashbacks cut in, I think, makes you see just how much was done to her by her father and how much was done to her by herself based on the seeds of doubt that her father planted.
Mm-hmm.
And on the way back from the fight with Valravn, I don't know if you found this, Pete, but there's a rock that looks like a face, and if you focus on it, her mother kind of starts talking to her.
I spoke to the rock.
Yeah, and
Rock and I had a chat.
Just like you said, Noelle, where people with, was it anxiety or psychosis, that they can kind of, that seeing patterns in things where there might not be patterns.
That's called something. Hold on.
There's definitely
Sorry, you can continue.
There's a term for just faces, I know as well.
Aphasia. Pareidolia?
Yeah, that sounds right.
Sure.
I think aphasia is where you can't see faces.
But that was, I thought, one of the cooler ways to use her sight, because, you know, there's the illusions that kind of implies that she sees the world a little bit differently. There's the runes, and then there's this. There's a few other mechanics that they have later on, but I like that the metaphor of her seeing the world in a different way continues and plays out in different, in several different mechanics, not just the same way over and over again. And then after that, you go to Surt. So throughout this time, you're finding runes, and every rune results in a story from Druth, who might be my favorite character in this game. Druth's great.
Druth is great. Druth has a very interesting backstory, too. So Druth, I'm going to get some of this wrong, and I'm going to feel bad, but Druth's village was raided by Vikings, and in order to survive, he basically had to become a slave to the Vikings. So he would go out on raids with them and sort of, he was a slave to these Vikings. And then in order to escape, he had to run through basically what amounted to a wall of fire. There was a fire that he escaped through. It was very badly burned, and he ended up living in this forest where eventually he met Senua. That's sort of a Cliff Notes version. There's other things going on, but that's the basic idea.
And Druth is also the person that is telling you all the stories about the Norse gods the entire time. And she says, like, in the beginning, like when you first encounter one of those things that tells you stories, or like that gets him to tell you stories, she's like, I need you to tell me your stories so that I can keep myself like sane, basically.
Yeah, so I can prepare myself for the quest to come, which it's cool how she frames it both as the game keeps going between whether this is a matter of being kept sane or whether she's preparing for actual combat against actual mythological forces. And it just keeps, I mean, the whole game exists in that space between reality and fiction. And I thought Druth's appearances, once you go to the Surt section, because he was burned, and many of his stories come out of that, in the Surt section, the main mechanic is there are tributes to Surt that when you focus on them, the world bursts into flames, and you need to run through these doors that are otherwise barred. And every one of those you get through, Druth kind of appears, and it's really cool how they do it because Druth is it's an actor in a costume that is just basically full motion video played on top of the world. It's just like raving about some story that he's telling Senua, like, you haven't seen anything until you've seen the fire, like I've seen the fire. Those flames meant danger, but also freedom.
Is there any way to fail those trials? I mean, I ran quick enough that I got through. If you hesitate too long, do you just burn?
Yeah, you burn to death.
Okay.
And through it, I guess we didn't mention this, but at the beginning of your quest, after you touch the door to hell, a dark curse appears on Senua's arm, and it looks like some sort of disease or something. And the game tells you that every time Senua dies, that curse will continue to move up Senua's arm, and if the curse ever reaches her head, the game is done, and it will erase it. You cannot continue, is what it says. Basically, the game will be deleted, which is a cool conceit.
But supposedly,
it's a lie.
Yeah, it's a lie. It doesn't operate that way.
Yeah, but
which is, again, like it would have been cooler if it did. I mean, that's just kind of like a shady way to operate.
But I like it.
But I think it also adds the level of not being able to trust the game, like itself. Like, as much as she can't trust her reality, like we can't trust the reality that the game is displaying for us, or the rules that they are saying are rules, but they're not.
Yeah. The rules they're putting into place might not, in fact, be rules. And I just loved the cert section. I thought was a little bit. It wasn't as interesting mechanically because it's basically find the tribute and then run to where you need to go.
Yeah.
But just seeing more of Druth and hearing more of his stories was, I thought, some of the more interesting stuff in the game. So I was happy to do it. And cert is a much easier fight than Valravn.
Yeah, cert's sort of just a straightforward tankish sort of thing. He has a heavy attack you avoid and then get in close for some damage.
Yeah, he's a big dumb idiot.
Yeah.
That's not nice.
I mean, it makes sense.
He might be very intelligent.
Yeah, he might be. Just from the mythology, though, it seems like he's a big dumb idiot.
Big dumb fire idiot.
Yeah.
Which you wail on him and then he goes down. After fighting Valravn for like 10 minutes, I expected the cert fight to take a while too, but cert went down in like 2 minutes because I figured I learned the game by that point.
That helps.
And so
despite never learning how to kick.
Yep, I learned enough to
just
wail.
enough.
It was not great. I wish I had learned more. I wish I knew about that kick. But after you defeat Cert, you can open the gate to hell. And you open the gate, you start walking, and then Hela, the goddess of death, comes and basically knocks you on your ass and blows you off of the bridge to hell.
Mm-hmm. Shatters your sword, too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you think you're dead.
Don't you, try to hit her or something, and then it really doesn't work?
Yeah, the sword just breaks.
And it, breaks. I feel like she tries to hit something, and then it's, shatter. Sorry,
yeah, and then her mind seems to shatter because, the next thing you see is her, wallowing in fear and depression, and then she, she heats up her sword and then, cuts her face with her sword.
Yeah, with one of the shards left over.
It's real dark.
Yeah.
So if the game started off grim, it maintains that grimness, or even it elevates it as it goes.
Yeah, and Dillian, this is, I think, when you first hear the shadow, which is this dark voice that basically expresses all of your doubt. It mocks you, it insults you, and while it's talking, Senua hurts herself.
Yep.
So that's really the most destructive of the voices.
Yeah, at this point we've heard kind of the chorus of voices in her head. We've heard a little bit of Senua actually speaking. We've heard Druth, Dillian,
the narrator voice,
the
narrator, the shadow,
her mother. If you talk to the wall,
yeah, her mother, and occasionally, I don't know if we've met her father yet.
I don't think he's come up.
Yeah, I think he comes up in the next section.
Yeah,
the next section you need to forge a new sword. You follow this ghost that seems to be Dillian to a tree, and in the tree is a sword that you cannot pull out until you've gone to these different shards to reforge the sword.
Very Arthurian in its way.
Yeah, and each of the shards is a trial that kind of tells some of Senua's past.
Mm-hmm.
The first one is and they are both trials and also parables, like Norse parables, but they are both autobiographical and fictional. And again, this game exists kind of in that space. The first one that I did was it was basically a maze. It's an underground maze that you have to find.
Right, you have to light torches, and based on where you can see those torches, you know which direction to go in.
Yeah, and there are shields that look like at a certain point you're in an infinite loop, and you need to kind of detect slight differences between the different forks in the road to progress. And then once you get out, it turns out that I think that's when you meet her father, because her father like talks about you can't leave home because you're cursed.
Yep.
You have a darkness in you that if I let you out, your curse will spread to others and destroy them.
Yeah. And basically she's damned the village. Is that the correct term? And that is... She also I don't know if she directly blames herself or if her dad is still alive after the massacre to blame her. It's unclear, but she definitely takes the blame for what happened to Dillian and the rest of her village while she was away. Also, by the way, she went away and went to the forest.
Even earlier than
conquer her darkness.
Yeah. Even earlier than that, though, it seems like from when she was a child, her and her mother both heard voices. And her father said that her mother spoke to the spirits of the underworld, and that's what drew the darkness and the curse into her mother and ultimately destroyed her.
Aside from you setting her on fire.
Well,
just a minor thing.
Spoilers.
Sorry.
No,
we already gave the spoiler.
Yeah, we did, but that's even more.
But
I think the chronology is first she's born, she hears the voices too. There's a plague.
There's a plague in Dylan's village.
Yeah, in Dillian's village. There are a few outbreaks of like disease that are blamed on Senua because she hears voices instead of being blamed on illness. They say that she is cursed and it is her fault that these bad things have happened.
They didn't really know about germs in the 19th century.
No, 19th?
19th, or excuse me. Well, they knew them in the 9th century, I should say.
Okay. It's a little late in the game. I mean, we didn't get everyone on board by then, but we were maybe not.
The Vikings came back around. They were like, "Oh, you guys are still Vikings?" Like, yeah, we're still Vikings.
We were hanging out in the north. Tough for you guys.
I feel like that was the best example of showing like mental illness in a social standpoint, that the like kind of treating it as an illness and as something that could be passed on to other people, and especially like back in the day when they thought like, oh, you're a witch or you're some kind of mythical being that needs to be exterminated because you're hearing these things and all that stuff. Because a lot of the game is just your like Senua's personal experience, and that's all you're following. So I thought it was good that they kind of added in that part that really showed the social implications of living with psychosis and all that stuff.
Yeah, and in the moment, so one of the next ones, the next shards was, at least that I did, was walking through tainted water. And like there's a bunch of bodies that have clearly perished due to illness. And during that segment, the narrator says something along the lines of, it was easier to blame Senua's to rather than think that Senua might simply have another way of seeing the world, it was easier to blame it on a curse, because if her way of seeing the world was legitimate, then that would mean questioning the way others saw, their own sense of reality.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a really poetic, prescient way to put the game. I wish I had the quote itself, but it basically it makes it very clear how much she is stigmatized simply due to a lack of understanding by those around her.
I feel like this also kind of, I don't know if we want to get political right now.
Sure.
Yeah, whatever.
This is deep
This is our
listening.
show.
We go deep.
But it kind of lends to kind of the recent events, at least in America, of the mass shootings that have been happening, that our president has decided to blame on mental illness. And I think that it goes to show that it's easier to blame it on something being wrong with the individual, with their way of thinking, than to just accept that some people do these things without having any illness to explain it away. Rather than it being like normal, like a normal person doing it, it's easier to say, well, they're sick and that's why they did it.
Yeah, and also mental illness is used in this game as a way to explain away systemic problems that people had not found the tools to grapple with yet, or the intellectual understanding. So when illness came, instead of trying to figure out the scientific root of the illness or what could have caused it in the first place, they just find someone who's mentally ill and say it was a curse that you brought on us, instead of trying to solve the root problem.
Yeah, which honestly, Dillian was kind of a dick in that scene. Because in the scene, Dillian's dad dies of this illness, and he yells at Senua as if this was at all her fault, which must have been really hard-hitting for her, because that is the one person that she kind of counted on to be on her side and to understand her and to really help her get out of this darkness or whatever. She called him like the light in the darkness. And it must have been like a really difficult thing to experience, that he was then thinking of her the way that all the other villagers and such were thinking of her.
Dillian's kind of a dick in a few scenes, if you ask me.
Yeah. He's not the best.
Like, there's a later moment, this might be unfair to Dillian, but like towards the end of the game, Dillian makes a comment about, again, we should probably have the exact quote, but if you guys can help me out a little bit, it's something along the lines of like, you wouldn't want to give up the way you see the world, darkness and all, because then you wouldn't see the beauty you also see in it. Something along those lines.
Yeah.
Like sort of framing her psychosis as both blessing and curse.
Oh, so it's a Spider-Man situation. Got it.
Yeah, pretty much, right? And this is, I'm no expert in any of these fields, but, I've done some reading, and this is sort of the same problem I had when I was reading up on sort of how the Asperger pride movement, right, the sort of framing themselves as sort of Asperger syndrome somehow became the symbol of autism spectrum disorders, right? It's sort of allied situations where it's a much more dramatic, difficult experience that's sort of hard to live with. And maybe for some of these people, pursuing a cure or sort of trying to make these dramatic changes is appropriate, right? And Dylan's sort of eliding that reality, I feel, in that moment. Cases where, maybe just this is difficult to live with and these people don't want to frame it as Dylan's presenting it, let's say.
Yeah, and I feel like Dillian...
I keep calling him Dylan. Dillian.
Yeah.
He's got too many vowels in his name. I'm sick of it.
Frickin' Dylan. When he's being handsome and charming, he's Dillian. But when he's being a dick, he's Dylan.
He's Dylan.
But yeah, Dillian, when there are moments where he's being tremendously supportive in a way that I don't think anyone else in that time could bring themselves to, and it's treated like Dillian basically rejects the gods and he rejects all of their faith. And so he basically says, look, I just believe you see the world differently than other people. I don't actually think that any of this God stuff's real. And because he's basically an atheist, it allows him to have a relationship with Senua that's really deep and meaningful, which is okay. That message is okay, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess.
But he's also sending them. Sorry.
Go ahead. No, I was just going to say, I guess in a world where theology is so ubiquitous, like Senua's father is a priest, maybe atheism as the only escape from a very specific, very damaging conception of the world makes sense, because there is no alternative way, at least it seems, there's no alternative presented in this game. There's either theology or atheism with no in-betweens, no other framing devices for knowledge. Were you going to say something, Noelle?
I was. No, back to what Pete was saying before about Dillian kind of not really validating her own experience and kind of trying to make it seem like a positive, even if she didn't see it that way. I think that's also like, as much as this is like a mystical story and whatever, that also plays to the realism of how people might interact with people with mental illnesses and try to explain away their pain by saying like, oh, it's not that bad, or oh, it helps you see things in a different way. It helps you understand things in a different way, rather than focusing on the fact that like this person, it could be suffering. This person is having a lot of struggles. But it's also like that thing that you can't entirely understand someone with a mental illness unless you are in their shoes. Because even if you have the same mental illness, everyone experiences it differently.
Yeah. And ultimately, it seems like Dillian's acceptance of Senua at face value leads to his own, not necessarily his own destruction, but it leads to Senua's mental ruining, because she at one point says, I need to be away from you because my my darkness will destroy you. It will destroy everyone. I need to conquer it on my own. And so she goes off into the woods by herself to conquer her own darkness. And the last thing she needed was to be alone. But because Dillian just kind of, he wants to be supportive, and he thinks the way to be supportive is by letting her handle things on her own, it seems to lead to both his destruction and hers, because she is a very capable warrior, and she was not there when the Vikings came. It might have saved her life, but it also might have doomed. You don't really know. It seems like she might have made a difference based on all the fights that you participate in.
Yeah, she's a badass. I appreciate that about her character.
True.
But Dillian's too much of a nice guy.
But also, doesn't Dillian like at first kind of resist and say like, I want to go with you? And
yeah.
Whatever.
And she says, no, I need to do this by myself.
And she just pushes harder, and then he's like, all right.
Yeah, basically. But I feel like at some point, when someone's saying, I'm going to go off in the woods by myself to go conquer my darkness, maybe if you don't believe in any of that, I don't know if the right decision is to be accepting of their decision, or to say, hey, I think you need my help.
Yeah, I mean, he definitely could have kind of hammered it home that it wasn't her fault that like his dad died and like all these other people died, and therefore seeing as her own, the voices in her head are not causing these deaths, that there's no danger in him going with her.
Yeah, but
that didn't seem to cross his mind.
He can't cross that bridge. And so you reassemble the sword, you pull the sword from the tree, not the stone, the tree. And now you've got a badass sword that glows blue when you hold down the heavy attack button, and that thing hits hard.
Yep.
And then you can kind of progress further.
Pretty.
It is very pretty. And you can progress further into hell. You cross the bridge. After this section, you fight like an executioner. You fight some tougher enemies, and then you encounter one of some other really cool perspective puzzles. One of them, when you look at, there are certain parts of the world that are broken, and you can kind of see shards of reality floating in front of you. And if you look at those shards from certain angles, it shows, slightly different geometry, and if you focus on it, that version of reality comes into being. So like maybe there's a bridge that's broken, and if you look at it from a certain perspective, it's not broken. or a wall is there and then it's not. And I thought that was another cool use of the focus mechanic. You keep progressing. There's a day-night sort of world, one where it's like a rainy future and then a idyllic sunny past.
You have to look through masks in order to switch between the two. The voices have a lot to say about those switches too.
Yeah, they're really not pleased when you go to the dark, rainy place.
They're very unhappy.
Yeah, I like it here. This is nice. I like it here. Don't make us go back. Why are you going back? I think she wants to go back.
Fool.
I think she has to go back. Don't go back. The voices are the best.
Yeah, it's a nice touch.
Voices.
Like, especially, the game is visually beautiful, especially when we talk about, the faces and the expressions and everything. But it is sort of bleak, generally. Like, there's not a lot to see as beautiful as it is. So the voices are a nice sort of through line through everything to keep things moving, keep things different in this sort of bleak landscape. I mean, it's hell. You don't expect wildflowers.
What if there were?
Let me write that down. That's the new. That's the title of the show.
What if that's someone's version of hell? Just butterflies everywhere.
They just have true, or they just have terrible allergies and they're just sneezing the whole time. Curse this pollen. So this is the moment you get some. I think this is the point, right, where you get some sort of information about her father and their sort of relationship earlier, but this is really where he becomes sort of the focal point. His relationship with Senua becomes the focal point of the narrative.
Yes. Yeah, this is the point where his relationship with Senua becomes really significant, and when Dillion starts to fade.
Yes.
Because you're constantly chasing him, and once you've gotten past these puzzles, you get into an area that's just all darkness. And there's this giant monster. I forget. It's a pig monster. It's
like a dog sort of thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a big pig.
It's a demodog.
The boss, you mean? Or the creatures in the darkness?
Yeah, the creature in the dark. I forget what its name is, though. It's like... It begins with a G, and it's really gross sounding.
It's really Norse.
Real Norse. What is this thing's name? It's like Grund or something.
Grund.
Let me try and find.
You're talking about the one that literally spits out darkness, right?
Yeah, eventually when you see it. Hellblade GR? Is it Grom?
Who the
Maybe.
heck knows?
Yeah, sure.
Why not?
Can someone else look it up? Because I've got a thing to
Sure.
say, and
I'll track it down while you're saying things.
Yeah. So the section in the darkness, I thought this is the moment where I felt the game was overloading the word darkness with too many meanings, because
It did a lot of things.
You're wandering around in literal darkness. There's also... Oh, actually, there was a section when you're reforging the sword that I forgot that I thought was very cool. It's a section where you're in darkness and you have to use hearing and your focus ability to kind of navigate, because it's complete blackness in all directions. I thought that was pretty cool. Just a shout out, that was a cool area.
Interesting. Well, it kind of goes forward a little bit. Or like what I'm about to say is going to go forward a little bit, but later on, darkness becomes like more of a prominent fear that actually can lead to your death if you stay in it for too long.
Yeah, and
I don't know what changes exactly. Where
it's Fenrir, by the way.
Fenrir? Okay.
Yeah. You lied. It's not a G.
Sorry. Sorry.
But yeah, I don't know if the voices just became more fearful and what's it called? I don't know what happened, but basically the darkness didn't bother her that much in that scene. But later on it's like more
Yeah.
of a problem.
So once you enter Fenrir's domain, that's where it starts becoming a thing. So the shadow, this dark voice tells you, like, if you're in the darkness, he'll kill you. And you need to embrace the darkness. The darkness will kill you. You can't fight it. And when they say the darkness, they literally mean if you stand in the dark for too long, you die.
Yeah.
They also mean that the darkness is a metaphor for Senua's mental illness, and that if you wallow in this darkness, it will kill you. But the darkness also, like, there's the curse, which is what Senua's illness, just like being around her, they imply that is a curse that will destroy everyone around her.
Mm-hmm.
The darkness could mean darkness in terms of religious darkness.
Yeah, it's like a general intergenerational violence going on as well.
Yeah, and so you've got all of these different terms, and the creature that you're fighting it's like this pig monster that lives in darkness. So by overloading this single image, she's scared of the dark too. Like, it just has so many potential meanings at any given time, and they just keep saying the darkness, the darkness, the darkness, that it stops. At a certain point, it stopped having any meaning for me at all. I couldn't pin down what they were trying to say at any given time.
Gino, I generally agree with you, and Noelle, you'd probably know better than me on this, so I'll say my point, and then if I'm wrong, you can smack me down or what have you.
Sounds fun. Go ahead.
Right. But the sort of nebulousness might be serving a more sort of... The abstraction might be worthwhile insofar as, like, when you think about something like the DSM, right, the diagnostic something manual. What's the S?
I don't remember.
Yeah, right. You just call it the DSM. It's too long.
Yeah.
So you think about something like the DSM, right? In a certain way, you could say the lines, and again, I don't really know that much, but I'd suggest that the lines in the DSM aren't really as clear cut as the DSM wants to make them seem, right? That it's sort of hard to draw these clear boundaries between a lot of these sorts of things. So maybe
statistical. Sorry.
Diagnostic statistical, right? Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe it's hard to draw lines between a lot of these things and sort of ask, okay, here's precisely what's going on. Now we know, let's label it. So maybe, you're having all these things meld together in a sort of one unit called darkness, in the same way that a lot of sort of symptomologies, stressors, past events, chemical imbalances, let's say, all sort of maybe blend together to create, a certain mentality.
Yeah, and I think that the game is intentionally doing this because for Senua, her understanding of darkness is this kind of mixed metaphor. She understands what's going on inside of her head and what she experiences, but she's told to interpret it through different lenses from Dillian and her father and her mother. Like, all of them phrase it different ways. And her father was a priest who told her all these stories. Druth was a priest who told her all of these stories. And when you combine all of those things in an active mind, it can be hard to tell where one metaphor, where reality ends and fiction begins, and where one metaphor ends and another begins. I know certainly I have had times where if I'm in the right mental state, I'll make mental leaps that do not make sense as soon as I am out of that mental state. I don't know if you've ever had that experience, but there are times when I'm in a heightened emotional state.
Thoughts.
And not irrational, but like connections that don't make sense in other contexts. Like I never would have gone down that mental path had I not been primed for it.
Yeah, I also think that the simplicity of using the word darkness as pretty much everything in relation to Senua and her mental illness also reflects on the fact that, like, they don't have the words to explain it.
Mm.
Like, that's the only thing that they can, like, they don't have a wide vocabulary. They didn't know that, like, germs were the things that were killing people. So, like, you can't really expect them to be very good at talking about these things and have words to describe them.
Excuse me, High Priest, I believe that this is caused by the corpses. We're not burying them far enough away from town.
No, you're foolish.
Perhaps we should not drink of the water, for it has killed many.
I'm sure it's fine.
You get the hell out of here. Get my daughter here, hit her a bit. It's her fault. Yeah, so once you get through the section, it's an entire section in darkness. You have to keep a torch lit, or else Senua just dies. And then you end up fighting this pig this like corpse pig
Fenrir.
Fenrir, that is cool looking, but a really frustrating fight.
Mm-hmm.
Because you can't see.
It does
you
stink.
Can't see.
I mean, it does. Maybe not. It stinks that the first boss is really the best one, as far as I'm concerned.
Agreed. Valravn was, I thought, the best boss.
Valravn, yeah.
Yeah. Because this is a situation where the game has depth to its combat, but the depth I felt actually was a detriment for me because I did not want to execute the parry attack at a certain point. Like, the combat doesn't evolve all that much, even as you give me a heavy attack and a charge-up attack and focus moves. It doesn't evolve to a level where I found it compelling unto itself. I just found it to be a barrier between me and further story.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and that pig monster, the fucking pig monster.
I think that was one of the problems that probably the developers had, where how can we bring these fights, because we have to keep these people interested, and what else could keep them interested more than like slaughtering some people? And they still wanted to kind of bring in the mental illness and the distortion of reality, which is difficult when you're fighting something, because you have to be able to see it, and a lot of time you couldn't see it.
You need to know what you're fighting, at least in some capacity.
Yeah.
Yeah, and every time you're fighting this thing, there are moments where if you step out of this one ray of light in the center of the arena, it's not just that you can't see. They play these red images of like Senua's past, and she's supposed to be grappling with her past in this moment, so it kind of makes sense. But, the darkness in her path, the things that her father did to her. It's a metaphorical fight against her father as much as it is a fight against this pig monster. But when you're in the darkness, you literally can't see the thing you're fighting against, and it will hit you. And it's not like the game's like, wow, this is really a tough metaphorical battle. It's like, no, you start the fight with the pig again.
Yeah.
Do it more.
Just keep doing it.
There is, in fact, a literal pig monster here that you need to deal with.
That you need to deal with, and if you don't deal with it, it will literally kill you.
Yeah.
And I liked the fight. I would love to watch someone fight it. Hey, Noelle, how was watching someone fight it?
It was
very cursy?
Interesting. I don't know. You got very angry. So maybe someone without all the anger.
This is where Billy would have chimed in and just be like, yeah, you're just bad at games, Gino.
Thanks.
Thank you for filling in.
He's bad at this. He just doesn't get it. He needs to parry. Why doesn't he parry?
I mean, really, they told you what to do. You just need to listen.
You just didn't listen.
You need to parry. Why doesn't you parry? It's dark. Stay in the light.
Sometimes they were kind of real dicks about it.
He's vomiting darkness.
They were just like, she can't do it. She should just give up now. He's way too fast for her. It's you have to be supportive.
Yeah, you could. Once you kill the pig monster, once you kill Fenrir, Senua basically pieces together that her father burned her mother to death, and her mother wasn't just driven mad and then just died in like this abstract way. Oh, the darkness consumed her. She's like, no, the darkness didn't consume her. You burned her to death for defying you.
Yep.
Repressed memories come back.
Yeah. And as soon as those repressed memories come back, I thought, oh, this is going to be the final battle. And it was like, nope, you've got another.
You fool.
You got a bridge to reconstruct and like 5 more fights to go through. But once you've done those fights and you've reconstructed the bridge, and Druth has told you about Ragnarok, that's a great sequence. Druth becoming more and more unhinged about Ragnarok. And blood will run, and Loki will come on a boat.
It is a very interesting sort of mythos that, like, the Norse believed that up front that their gods were going to lose.
Yep.
Like, that'd be if one day Jesus will come back and he'll try to save us, but the devil will win. He'll beat Jesus.
Not only will he beat Jesus, all of our greatest warriors will rise up with Jesus to fight the devil, and they will lose again.
Yeah, and
They
still
will
lose.
fall. And the world will be cast into darkness.
It's a very interesting mythology.
Maybe it's just more
And-
realistic.
Endless movies.
Joe.
You can make endless movies out of it. Apparently. Thor Ragnarok in theaters now.
Are.
Yeah,
This
as
has
soon
just
as...
been a plug for Thor Ragnarok
Yeah.
the whole time.
I
We're
know,
looking
I
for
just...
sponsorship still.
Yes. I just loved when I saw the final rune, and Druth is telling you about it. He tells the story, and then he's like, Senua, Ragnarok is real, and it is coming soon. And it's nigh. And I'm like, Thor Ragnarok in theaters now. And then you finally get to Hela, the goddess of death. That sequence I thought was very cool. They just keep throwing more and more enemies at you, which that was not cool. But in this moment, when you get knocked down, instead of going down and then getting into this like woozy state where you need to fight your way back, she just rolls and then is like, nah, I'm not done. And then you just keep fighting. You fight
Like,
shadow
I'm a backup.
versions. Yeah, you fight a whole bunch of Norsemen, and then you fight the gods that you fought before, but they're in shadow form. And then you eventually get to this area where just things keep spawning, and you cannot kill them as fast as they spawn. And I think the voices say, let go?
Oh, at this point, you only have one voice.
Oh, yeah.
All the
I
other
forgot.
voices are left behind, and they're really upset about it.
Yeah.
They're like, don't go forward so we don't get left behind because we're going to die if you leave.
Yeah,
Which they were never really alive, so I don't see where they were going with that. But now there's only one like kind of supportive voice that you're hearing.
Yeah, I love when you walk up to the mirror that's going to make Senua kind of whole for a moment, and all the voices are like, she's going to die. But then what happens to us? We're going to die. I don't want to die. I don't want to die. Don't turn around. Stop.
You fool.
We don't want to die.
He gave me very specific instructions.
Yeah, and then Hela kicks your ass. You
Yeah.
go down. Hela
Hela
picks
is
up your
not
sword.
forgiving, like at
No.
all.
Hell is not messing around.
Yeah, she grabs you by the throat, stabs. And
She
Senua's
takes
just like,
the sword
yeah,
that you worked so hard for, and then she stabs you in the gut with it.
just really casually too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they go, meh.
Another
Poke.
Tuesday.
Yeah, like she's poking a toothpick through a marshmallow.
Standard goddess
like-
of death stuff.
Yeah.
Done. I did like Senua's, if you're not going to give me Dillion back, then you're going to have to kill me because I don't believe in you. I don't believe in anything anymore.
And she was just like, okay.
And she's like, sigh,
Yeah.
fine.
Can do. So she kills Senua, but then Senua comes to...
Well,
Then
she
she picks
goes
up
through-
Dillion's head, and then the goddess of death like drops Dillion's head off the mountain of hell, but then...
Wait, hold on. Back
Wait.
up first.
Okay, yep, go ahead.
She also goes through like a lot of stages of when she's talking to Hela. She's like first like just really depressed and defeated, and then she just starts trying to bargain with her, like saying like, you could take me, just like give Dillion his life back and like all this stuff. And then she starts just getting angry. Like she's there for a while just trying to talk to Hela and trying to convince her to do what she wants her to do, and Hela is just staring at her with a blank face like, nah, I'm
Of
good.
death.
But yeah, and then there are like these long pauses where she's just crying, and then there's a long pause where you think she's crying and she's laughing, and it gets really creepy for a second.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's like a lot of going on in her head at that point.
Yeah, but it
Which
is
is
the most
interesting 'cause
confident...
that's not during that point where a lot is going on in her head. None of the voices are there.
Yeah, and what I was going to say is that seems like that is the most whole that Senua is during the game. The voices aren't there. It is all her. She is completely lucid. And though she might be laughing at the absurdity of it all and pleading for her lover's life, she's not conflicted in the way that she is at almost every other moment. She's always listening to someone else's voice, and she's finally speaking with her own.
Yeah. The only other times you really hear her talking, aside from to Hela, is to the voices.
Or in flashbacks.
Yeah. But like in present day, whenever she talks, it's to the voices. Or to Druth.
Yeah. Which, of course, leads to Hela kills her. Hela then picks up Dillion's head and then drops it off the mountain of hell. And then the camera cuts back, and Hela is dead, and it's Senua standing and dropping the skull and saying, "Goodbye, my love." And then she basically says, like, "Catch my next adventure, y'all," and then pieces out.
Later. I was thinking, I don't know if that's Hela. Because it's just a burnt body. So it might be Druth.
Well,
that she's just been, like, carrying around.
No, it was half burnt and half tattooed. It was
Hela.
Hela.
Could you really see it from out? I mean, it just, at least to me, it just looked like burnt legs, and you couldn't really see.
I mean, it looked like Hela to me. It looked like the same character model.
Okay.
But I think it's a metaphorical thing that she overcame death.
Yeah.
That's my best guess. But this is again a moment where the metaphor seemed to get lost on me. Like, did she actually defeat? Did she actually defeat something? Or
she got over the grieving of and kind of accepted the loss of Dillion.
The implication is, though, that the story took place all in her own mind, right? That's sort of what we're left with.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that she actually got to the top of, like, she actually went to the top of a mountain with the skull, but there was never enemies, there were never monsters. Right. She probably dropped the skull off of the mountain, and then the grief was done. Right. I don't think she actually fought anything.
Okay.
Except herself.
Yeah, but I think Druth, it seems like most of the characters, most of the voices you're hearing that aren't clearly her voices were actual characters that existed.
Yeah, it seemed like
at one point
everything that occurred prior to, let's say, the canoe trip actually occurred.
Yeah, and this is another situation where I don't think it matters if it did or not.
Yeah.
But it's very, I think it's well told. You know, the way that they blend what is clearly coming out of her mind with what is supposed to be some sort of neurotypical version of reality. So what did you guys think of the game overall?
So
any takeaways?
Here's what I'd say, right? Let me ask you a question here, right? I get what the game's trying to do, right? It's trying to sort of create this experience of, we'll say psychosis, we'll say mental illness, just to keep things simple, for an audience that considers themselves normal, right? For a neurotypical audience. I get that's what the game's trying to do. But my question is, what is the game trying to say about psychosis, right? Because this is very obviously a rhetorical act, right? This isn't a simulation, right? It's not set in the modern day in which sort of we're just like, okay, this is the everyday experience for at least one individual with mental illness. Rather, this is a very obvious sort of hero's journey set in, 10th century Europe. It's making a rhetorical act. So I'm wondering, okay, what is the game trying to say? Because I can't quite figure it out.
I mean, sorry, go ahead, Gino.
You go first.
I think that, like, I don't know about what it's trying to say, but I think what it's trying to do is, like, give these neurotypical people an example of, like, this is what the experience is. Mm-hmm. And try to, like, let them see from the point of view of someone with these mental illnesses in a, like, user-friendly kind of way that, like, as a game, I feel like it's, like, that's kind of the best way to do it, because even if you're, like, watching a movie or whatever, or, like, reading a book, like, it's a very passive thing. Whereas when you're playing a game, it's very active, and you are a part of it, and that is you for the time being. So I think that it's trying to give neurotypical people the experience of having psychosis and trying to get them to understand at least some of the struggles that people with psychosis have to deal with.
Yeah, I think part of it is an act of empathy to get people to see through the eyes of another. But I also think there is clearly this element, like you could have chosen any culture, right? There are people with psychosis, with different forms of mental illnesses across cultures. So why pick this one? And I think that the reason they went with this specific story is a line that they actually say early on, that in the Norse tradition, the soul is in the mind. All that you are, all that you ever will be, is in your head.
Yeah, like I think it's like literally the head, not just the mind, but like the actual physical head.
Yes, and that is the seat of your soul, and that if anything is odd with it, or anything is different from what others perceive, it is a problem in a way that for some other cultures it is not. And yet there is still a tradition that people who hear voices are seers. They are supposed to be mystical in some way, empowered. And so you get this dichotomy where Senua's curse, where you have it, her mental state being both a gift and a curse simultaneously. You can see with her mom that she was revered until her voices were inconvenient for Senua's father. You can see that Senua's gifts save some people throughout her time as a warrior, because she can see things that others don't. And yet she lives on a razor's edge, because if at any moment things go bad, the world around her has a very easy scapegoat for what the problem is, and it must be her mind that is causing whatever the problem happens to be at the moment. If they're attacked, it's her fault that they're attacked. If there's illness, it's her fault. And so you end up seeing a world where there's tremendous power in seeing through a different perspective, but also tremendous danger in being marginalized in that way and stigmatized. So I think that it really does a great job of mixing Norse mythology, and this is the second game we've played with Norse mythology very explicitly. Jotun just kind of wants to tell the stories, very similar actually to when you call on the runes.
Yeah.
Jotun is kind of like the runes, but
That's
the whole game.
Yeah,
that's the whole thing.
That's it.
But Hellblade, I think, it finds a mythology that really fits this particular definition of mental illness, and it's really, I guess the way I would explain it is, there's two schools of game design that I've learned it mostly through Magic the Gathering card design or set design, but there are two different ideas about how a game should be created. One is top down and one is bottom up. Bottom up means you come up with a mechanic or a central idea for a mechanic of gameplay, and then you design everything from that. So maybe you come up with a mechanic that's, a jumping mechanic, like a Mario game, and then everything else about the game, it flows from that one mechanic. Once you have jumping, well, how do you kill enemies? Oh, you jump on them. How do you advance? You jump over things, you jump around things.
Jump. You just jump. Everything's jump.
Yeah, but what are secrets? Oh, maybe if you jump into something from the right angle, you pass through it instead of bumping into it. There's a whole bunch of things that can flow from that one mechanic. Whereas top-down game design is, here's this high-level story conceit or this high-level concept that we're trying to get across, and we're going to design the game from this stylistic decision, and all the mechanics will flow out of that. And I feel like this is an excellent example of top-down design, because I think they started, we're going to make a game about mental illness. We are going to, okay, what are we going to do from there? Well, what if we set it in a Norse mythology? Because I think that would allow for all of these different implications. Like the darkness can mean all these different things. There are all these gods that talk about seeing illusion, seeing fire where there is none, all of these different traditions that we can draw from to make the story. So once you start from that, you get to Norse mythology. Then once you get to there, okay, what can the mechanics be? Oh, well, Valravan's this god in the forest who's got illusionary powers, and you see the world differently when you when you encounter this god. Oh, perfect. Fire, the Vikings are sacking places. Well, maybe they could be traumatized from a Viking attack. Oh, Surt, the god of fire, we could use that too. And you start getting these tendrils of game design coming down all from that one idea of we're going to make a game about someone with psychosis. And I think it's really excellently executed in that way.
I know you guys both make great points on the subject, and that's why I brought the question up. I would just like to sort of finish, because it's my question and I get to have the last word like that. That in some ways, especially with, I shouldn't say especially with this subject, but almost any subject really, is that if the goal is to create a quote unquote authentic experience, I think it's important to remember that that's in a lot of ways a doomed endeavor from the start, right? And this is at its heart a rhetorical act. So I think it's important to remember that choices were made in the decision to portray mental illness and psychosis in this way. And I think we always have to foreground that recognition that this isn't a documentary, even if something like a documentary were possible in this case. It is a rhetorical act making a point, and we need to appreciate that.
Yes, I agree wholeheartedly. And as someone who, most of the time when I see top-down game design, it can feel very forced because you're trying to, you're literally creating a game from an idea that is not necessarily expressed in gameplay. It can sometimes, the concept can be more difficult to express. The concept can be simpler, maybe written down or expressed through a movie. Sometimes a high level concept like that will be hard to communicate through gameplay or communicate through moment to moment experiences like that. But this game, I think, manages to get those ideas into every mechanic. Now, unfortunately, I think that the game leans a little too much sometimes onto the seeing things from a different perspective, just to pad out length. I think this game could probably be 1/3 shorter, and it would probably be to the game's benefit because there's just a few too many rune puzzles. But it really, all of the mechanics work. Where I can think of plenty of top-down mechanics that just didn't have the depth, or they were cute ideas but they didn't actually work. They didn't stay compelling. I thought Hellblade did a good job. Ninja Theory, great studio. They do pretty much nothing but good work. And they're one of the only studios around that still gets to have a high budget and make narrative-focused single-player games, it seems like.
Mm-hmm.
So any other thoughts on Hellblade before we call it a night?
Well, I thought that this was seeing as they're talking about psychosis, which is probably one of the most demonized symptoms of mental illness. I thought it was really good that they were showing the fact that it's the person to fear is the thing that's scary about psychosis is what the person that has it is experiencing. The fact that they're hearing voices, the fact that they're seeing things, the fact that they're having delusions and have kind of a separation from reality. That's the scary part. It's not the individual that has the mental illness that should be feared. And I thought that really came across well in this game.
Yeah, just as a general PSA, right? People with mental illnesses are overwhelmingly the victims of crime, not perpetrators.
But also, especially schizophrenia in America, because psychosis isn't really used in the U.S. as much. They kind of just put it under the umbrella of schizophrenia.
You mean it's not really used as a diagnosis?
Well, it's not a diagnosis. Term? It's a level. It's symptoms.
Okay.
But in the U.S., it's more you just say the person has schizophrenia rather than they have psychosis symptoms and whatever. But that, I did a whole thing on this, but schizophrenia is by far the most negatively portrayed in the news. They have the most connections with violent acts and stuff than any other mental illness, and like far too high of a percentage. And yes, and like it's going down, thankfully, but it's still far too high. But yeah.
Yeah, and like you said, this game really communicates that the scariest thing is being in Senua's mind is terrifying for her. It's not just terrifying for Dillian or anyone else. She is actively being terrorized by those around her and by her own mental state. And when people reach out a helping hand, it makes all the difference for her. Just having one person that treats her like a human being instead of a monster.
Yeah, and even when that one person is not perfect in the way that they interact with her and her illness and all that stuff, like she's still that's her light. Like that's who she needs, and like that's why it's so important to kind of get rid of the stigma and have a game like this to kind of make people understand what people that have psychosis symptoms go through, because they need people. They need a support system, just like anyone with any mental illness, physical illness, anyone in general. Like they need people to understand. They need people to try to accept them. And I think it shows the reality of it, that like you're not going to have the perfect relationship where they completely understand you, but it'll be, maybe you'll have a relationship that's enough.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a good place to end on. So, Hellblade, Senua's Sacrifice, good game. If you would like to get in touch with the show or have some of your own stories to share, you can do so at Deep Listens or at That Pinguino on Twitter, deeplistens.libsyn.com, or at Deep Listens podcast at gmail.com. Sorry.
Isn't that the one like you always mess up?
It's
I
usually
feel like
the last
last
one.
time I was on, you also messed that up.
Yeah,
Sorry.
It's usually the last one, deeplistenspodcast at gmail.com, and that's usually the one I screw up. But for the next episode, so Pete, you're on hiatus at some point soon, correct?
Yes, 2 weeks from now.
2 weeks from now, you're going to be on hiatus, so I'm going to have to find something. So 2 weeks from now, which means the next game we would play. So I think that's probably going to be the Magic School Bus then. I will have to I'll have to audible then.
Fun story. We were upstairs in the attic and trying to look for this game, and I was like, what makes you think you still have this game? Like, why wouldn't you have like thrown it out? And also, why would it just be like readily available to you? Why wouldn't it be in like some box on the bottom of everything? And then 2 seconds later, he found it.
Of course,
I was like, how?
Of course he did.
Because I knew exactly where it was.
Buried under like 4 copies of Psychonauts, probably.
No, those are all digital copies. I don't have any physical copies of Psychonauts. I have as many digital copies as I can carry. But yes,
his entire computer is just different files of Psychonauts.
Copies of Psychonauts.
It's 250 gigabytes of Psychonauts. So the next time we are on, we will be playing the Magic School Bus, and this is. So
go watch the TV show on Netflix to remind yourself.
So this will be the Magic School Bus explores. Oh, there's a lot of Magic School Bus games. What was the name of this one?
You don't have it?
I'm sure
I have it, but I'm not going to go look for it.
That's not the Magic School Bus game I wanted.
Wasn't it the marine one?
It is. It's the underwater one, but I don't see that as a... Oh, no.
Why didn't you just look up underwater one?
One of the games. We'll play a Magic School Bus game.
No, the
There'll
people
be
need
fish.
to know.
It'll be great.
They need to know. It's not Going Places. It's not Discover's Flight. It's not
I bet
Inside
that
the
the
Earth.
bus turns into a scuba.
It's not the human body. It's not the solar
I
system.
bet it turns into a big turtle.
That would be better.
Guys, I'm sorry to say, I don't think GiantBomb.com has the Magic School Bus game we're going to be playing. Wait 1 second. I'm going to go get the proper name. I'll be back in a sec. Fill time for a second.
Okay.
All right, so tell you what, while we're talking about things, right, this is a point I potentially wanted to bring up earlier. Now that
Okay.
Noelle's much better point has been elided in Gino's quest for magic school buses. But I think there's something to be said that I think one of the biggest problems in a lot of areas, right, is that people take what are continuums and turn them into discrete categories. So, like, things like sexuality, right, or gender, things that are much more fluid. And I think it especially happens with mental illness, right? Like, there's these we've established two categories. You either, to use unnuanced terms, you're either sane or insane, and that's really not how it works. It's a continuum we exist on. And I think if we recognize that, we'd all be better off.
I agree wholeheartedly.
It's the Magic School Bus Explores the Ocean.
Okay, now we got it.
Thank goodness.
I assume
I feel like we could have gotten there if we tried.
Explores the ocean. Like, close enough. We got it.
Maybe we'll also get the Magic School Bus Explores the Human Body. Maybe if you're good listeners, we'll do a twofer on the Magic School Bus. So
if you're all good, boys and girls.
The next episode will be the Magic School Bus Explores the Ocean.
All right. Sounds
Happy
good.
Thanksgiving.
All right. So thank you, Pete.
Always a pleasure. Like we said, an ambitious game that dropped the ball in some respects, but overall did something important in a very strong way.
Thank you, Noelle.
Thank you guys, and thank you guys for playing this with me and for allowing me to come on and talk about all this stuff that I think is very important. And I encourage anyone to play the game, even if it's just once, even if you find it frustrating. I think it could teach you a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And thank you, listeners, once again. Peace!